Yeah, just 1 second. Let's get one thing right. Assalamu alaikum ji. I'd like to thank the Islamabad Institute of Conflict Resolution for having me on this discussion, which is the recentering of Pakistan through geoeconomics in the backdrop of a global economic schema. I'll try to focus on a few points which, in my experience, have been very relevant. And just to give a very quick background before I get into the details, my name is Fahim. I've been primarily with the private sector. I have an extensive experience in the financial markets. I've written 4 books. I am currently with the government of Pakistan, and I'm advising on non-traditional security. Let's get things straight first. What is geoeconomics, and how does that sort of interplay? It's extremely important for us to understand that geoeconomics is considered to be slightly synonymous with geopolitics. So people use it interchangeably, which is fine. It's not an issue. However, it's extremely important for us to understand what the actual perspective, is, and how it's going to play out. For the time being, Pakistan has very recently taken a very new look towards dealing with the international community, which is geoeconomics. And up till now, we had geopolitics, and geopolitics. Now, I'll just very quickly define it, and then I'll get into the details. The world is run, whether we like it or not, on economics. And if there is good economics, there's going to be an ability of a country to basically assert themselves politically, geographically, ethically, morally, if necessary, but above all, economically. If a country does not have good economics, it's really not going to mean much if they've got good politics, good relations with countries. Because what's happened in, not now, but in the past, perhaps we can easily say, in the past 50 years, you can see that economics is playing the predominant role in allowing countries to interact with each other, and that's dictating how things are done. So before I get into Pakistan's scenario, I have to give a bit of a background, and that is that the world is basically dominated by certain countries, certain economies, and how they basically interact with the world is something we need to study, something we need to understand. And that will dictate how we will interact with certain countries and what room we find ourselves with going forward. Before we get into any country, before we get into understanding the total structure, which is a huge topic in itself, I'll try to keep it very short. It's extremely important for us to understand that the countries that dominate the economic sphere, one has to look at how they got there. We have to see the industrial base of that country, and we have to see their military prowess. I'll come to that in a second. Geoeconomics is not just about economics. It's about power. It's about being able to display your power and the ability to project your power far away from home in extreme cases. So when we try to understand how the world economy is structured, once again, that is a separate topic, but I have to touch upon it because we're looking at the global schema. Let's look at it from the developed, developing, and least developed countries' perspective. So in the developed segment, you have US, you have Germany. I'm giving just a few examples because of the paucity of time. You have to look at where they came from. You have to look at what their structures were. You have to look at their industrial base. You have to look at how they developed their industries first and then became economic influencers, and they were able to project their capacities across the earth. When we look at, for example, developing countries, that's what Pakistan is. And I mean, I give an example of Vietnam with it. So there are countries that are trying to get out of a rut, and they're trying to get into the developed phase, which is frankly far off. Then you look at underdeveloped countries such as Zambia, Haiti, and Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, I think, getting out of the least developed status. But you can clearly see that there are various dynamics which dictate whether a country is developed or developing or least developed. But here we're going to talk about 3-4 factors, namely their industrial base, what their path was coming to where they stand right now, and thirdly, their military prowess. Now, geoeconomics is not bubblegum stuff. Geoeconomics is not about just we're going to develop our economy and we're all going to be everything's going to be hunky dory. No, it's a pretty serious matter. When a country develops economically, that's good. That's sometimes not taken very well by other countries, especially those that are in conflict with the country that we're talking or that we're discussing, which in this case is Pakistan. Successful economies, they develop their physical infrastructure, they develop their financial infrastructure, they manage and develop the management of the interplay of the physical and financial infrastructure. They focus on innovation, they focus on productivity, and they also develop their ability to control violence, inflict and control violence. This is a very critical factor, which is frankly seldomly discussed. Since I've been talking about this quite extensively, I will bring it up here as well. There's another point that we need to bring in, which is costs. Costs are seldomly discussed openly, and especially in the light that I'm trying to discuss them, that whenever there was a low cost, countries developed. And if you look at historically, the US, UK, France, I'm just taking 3 examples, they basically developed, their industrial base developed when they had low costs, labor costs, metal costs, and fuel costs, and so on and so forth. So right now, you can clearly see that this cost structure has been affected in the past 30 years, something that Pakistan also has to do. If you look at China, basically, I always call it a cost war. China won the cost war internationally, where they were able to produce more products at a lower cost. And you see the same thing in Vietnam. Even China now is starting to face inflation. When you look at the US, I've given that example. If you look at Russia, even Russia had the ability to keep its costs low during the communist regime. That's when their industrial base grew. I won't get into how effective or rusty it was, but there was a massive industrial base. And you also have to analyze how these countries that I've just mentioned have been handling violence and the ability to manage violence. And it's not just defensive violence, it's like offensive violence as well. Now let's talk about Pakistan. A very quick background, then we'll come to what Pakistan needs to do. In Pakistan was, and forgive me, I can't exactly remember the statistic, but Pakistan was possibly one of the fastest industrializing countries in the 50s and 60s, to the extent that, as we know very well, many countries were coming to Pakistan, including China, to understand what industry is. That sort of stopped in the 70s when we sort of started playing with the dynamic forces of demand and supply. And we got into uncontrolled wars and expensive wars. And I'm using the word uncontrolled on purpose because that needs to be brought in. If you can control a war, that's something different. But if you can't control something, it's going to be very expensive. So since the 90s, coming to the 90s, Pakistan has been configuring its economy with the help of deregulation, with freedom, with incentives, with centralization, with decentralization. So we can see that Pakistan was trying to increase its economy. That played very well with us getting into the global economic structure. We started integrating very well, and we started getting foreign investors, and actually our GDP started going up until the violence started, which is quite visible, that the bombs and the violence basically slowed down our economy. And according to my estimates, we were losing $120 billion a year because of that violence. So adjusting oneself, now let's get to what Pakistan needs to do. Adjusting oneself to the global scheme, we have to bear 4 or 5 things in mind. These are not the recommendations. I'm just giving the background to the recommendations. Number 1, Pakistan has to be very clear about its economic policy. There has to be a proper planning structure, which basically reinvigorates, cleanses, reintegrates the economic structure, just like many countries have done. And those countries that have done sectoral reintegration have had tiny growths. Those countries that have done mass planning and reintegrations of their sectors have actually done very well. China being one of them, Vietnam being another one. So it's extremely important for us to understand that when we can handle costs, keep them down, we can sort of keep our we can plan things out very clearly, and we control violence. That will basically help us integrate more easily into the geo spectrum, and it will also help us really achieve this geo-economic thing. Here I have to pause for a second. Geoeconomics is not about geography leading to economics. Actually, I define it in reverse. It's the geography of economics. Wherever you can get a benefit, that's part of your geography. That's part of your economics. And whether it's Pakistan exporting to Fiji, which we're very tiny export to Fiji, if that's good for us, that should be part of our geography. So we need to start thinking like that. Now, coming down to the suggestions, what we need to do, first of all, we need to have an internal and an external view. We keep mixing it up. I don't know why. And then we keep mixing up the strategic, operational, tactical things. That's where things tend to get a little messy. I like to keep them separate, strategic, operational, tactical. Pakistan needs to ensure that internal strengthening happens through, number one, resolution of systemic issues, proper planning, integrated planning. Let's spend more time in planning, and we execute it once. Let's not experiment with planning. We need to expand our business volume, which we are working on as we speak. Whatever we're selling right now, let's try to double it. We have to, and we've frankly done a very good job, we have to increase our ability to control violence. And just look at COVID. COVID has basically destroyed the world economy. And if we had the ability, if we already had the ability to vaccinate ourselves as soon as something happened, we wouldn't be facing the issues that we're facing right now. Internally, it is extremely important that we must weaponize our economic diplomacy structure. That's how you fit better into the whole global schema. Externally, Pakistan needs to continuously build up its relationships with countries and not use politics as the first, as the harbinger of a relationship. It should be economics, economic benefits. We have to prioritize what we need to do externally very, very efficiently and very, very quickly. And I want to be absolutely unequivocal in what I'm about to say. We have to weaponize our imports. That basically means if you're buying something from a country, that country had better listen to you. And if they're not listening to you, what's the reason? Because business is critical. I'll just try to summarize what I've said. Geoeconomics is used synonymously with geopolitics, which is fine. But I define geoeconomics as the geography of economics, not the economics of geography. If we can do good business nearby in our vicinity, that's fine. If we can do good business far away, even in Antarctica, that's equally fine. Using economics as a tool of getting your political will achieved is how we need to start thinking. And I repeat, and you can just do your own Google searches. Look at how Pakistan's GDP was growing from 2004 onwards, and it was violence that basically stopped Pakistan. There were many structural issues, there are many hemorrhages, but violence had a key role to play in this, and I've been talking about this on various forums. So with this, I think I've tried to summarize some of these points, and I hope we can extend this discussion. And once again, I thank the Islamabad Institute of Conflict Resolution for having me on this discussion, and I wish you all the best.